Okay, in this lecture module, or teaching module, we're looking at positive and negative rights. This is a concept which comes from philosopher Isaiah Berlin. We need to look at positive and negative rights when we're looking at the rule of law and then the possibilities for redistribution. Some things to keep in mind when we're looking at the inequality and efficiency of the market. Efficiency versus equality in the market. Under classical liberalism, 1870 to 1914, up until the end of American slavery, up until the beginning of World War I, under the classical liberal period of early capitalism, you had mostly a negative rights rule of law, where the emphasis was on free from harm. Individuals, under the Enlightenment, the idea was contract law and trade, to facilitate trade. You had mostly a negative rights regime where if an individual was harmed, either contractually or bodily harm, criminal or a tort law, the state, if you couldn't work it out voluntarily, the state would step in and provide redress. So an individual, there was a steady, known, predictable, and observable, unchangeable rule of law, universal rule of law, a negative rights regime where you were free from harm. Then, with the buildup of the welfare state and redistribution, then you started to get a positive rights regime, rule of law. This especially started occurring in the United States in the 1930s. And then under a positive rights rule of law, you have the right to something. And if you read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, there's many categories in there. And so, for example, you have the right to healthcare, housing, work, transportation, housing I've got twice. Heat, electricity, depending what category it is. And in the United States, as long as you declare it on your income taxes or declare to the state that you're poor enough, then you have the right to these things. And when we look at the redistribution from a negative rights regime to a positive rights regime, we should keep in mind Anne Kroeger, 1974, The Political Economy of the Rent-Seeking Society, is that the state intervenes with positive rights for political reasons, for rent-seeking, for capture, for political favoritism, for populism, demagoguery, nationalism. So you have, under positive rights regime, under an active state, you then get these categories. You have the right to something instead of the ability to be free from harm. And so in order to create positive rights, then you have to violate negative rights because you're making transfers from some to others, political transfers from some to others as you move from a negative rights regime to a positive rights regime. And one of Anne Kroeger's points in The Political Economy of the Rent-Seeking Society was that the more intervention you have, the less the market works, the less the decentralized market, individuals acting in their own best interest, self-interest with others in mutual exchange, the less the market works, the less economic growth you have, and the less reduction in absolute poverty for everyone do you have. So Kroeger's point is that eventually the market will stop working. And I've heard it called, after the 2008-2009 financial crisis and all the interventions, you had something called the new normal, where historically in the 20th century, real economic growth was 3% a year. And then after the 2008-2009 interventions, economic growth was only 2% a year. So people were calling that the new normal. And then you have the current period, 2020, spring, summer 2020, you have massive the largest interventions due to the coronavirus interventions, the largest interventions since the Great Recession. So some people are calling this period the new not normal, which is, again, lower than historic levels of economic growth and larger than historical levels of monetary intervention and fiscal intervention, again, preventing the market from allocating scarce resources, lowering long-term projections for increasing standards of living for everyone. And then as long as you have social mobility, you don't have rent seeking, which brings us to Hayek, 1945, The Use of Knowledge in Society, where you start getting into who decides, who gets the right to various categories, who decides, how do they decide, why do they decide, and with what information, with what knowledge. So under political economy, under rent seeking, well, politicians decide so that they can gain votes and promise favors to some people while not promising the same things to their political oppositions. So I used to live in the ex-Soviet Union right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and under the Soviet Union, everybody was promised an apartment in the city and a dacha or a summer house in the country. Now, some people in the Soviet Union, they had huge concrete building blocks, building houses, public housing in the cities. And so all these blocks looked the same, but you'd open one door and it was a big, beautiful, spacious apartment. And that usually belonged to a member of the Communist Party, right? Everyone was promised 2,000 calories a day. Some people got caviar and salmon. Some people got rice and chicken. So everybody was promised positive rights, but those who made those decisions tended to benefit by that type of redistributional system. And in democracy, those transfers are for votes. So eventually there'll be such a movement from negative rights to positive rights. The market will stop working, and you have this slow decline of empire. So that's our teaching module on positive and negative rights. Thank you.